What if I tell you that the brain also has got a plumbing system, a water system in which a certain fluid flows from one point into another, just like how the water system works at your home. But this one is called the ventricular system, and this is what we're going to discuss today. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to NeuroSketch with Dr. Ken. But if this is the first time you've seen this channel, don't forget to subscribe. Today we're going to discuss the brain ventricular system, and this is our learning upshot. So we're going to discuss the CSF production, circulation, and the reabsorption, and of course also going to discuss the clinical neuroanatomy, which is hydrocephalus, which is coming as a separate discussion. So inside the brain we have the fluid-filled cavities. We have the cavities that are holding fluid. These cavities are called the ventricles. So the brain ventricles, these are the fluid-filled chambers within the brain that are holding a special fluid which is called the cerebrospinal fluid. And listen to the word cerebrospinal fluid. This is because this fluid is circulating between the brain and the spinal cord. Cerebro for brain, spinal for spinal cord. So this is a fluid which is circulating between the brain and the spinal cord. But within the brain we have special chambers that are called ventricles that are acting as a water system of the brain to circulate this fluid, this watery fluid within the brain. Okay, so we have a total of 4 ventricles, and by names we have 2 lateral ventricles. We have left lateral ventricle and the right lateral ventricles. These 2 ventricles, they are being housed within the cerebral hemispheres, respective cerebral hemisphere. That is to say, the left lateral ventricle is found within the left cerebral hemisphere, and the right lateral ventricle is within the right cerebral hemisphere. And then within the diencephalon we have the third ventricle within the diencephalon. And then the fourth ventricle is bordered superiorly bordered by the cerebellum and the pons, and the floor of the fourth ventricle is made up by medulla. So these are the 4 ventricles of the brain ventricles of the 4 brain ventricles. Okay, so these are the 4 brain ventricles. What are they one more time? 2 lateral ventricles. So these act as the first and second ventricles, the 2 lateral ventricles, and then we have the third ventricles within the the diencephalon, and then also you have the fourth ventricles. This is so important to notice the location of these ventricles. But I've told you this is like the water system of the brain. This is like the plumbing system, and we have said because the plumbing system, this fluid will have to move from one point to another. Let's say we want this fluid to move from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. That means we need to have a connection between these 2 ventricles. So let's figure out the connections between the ventricles of the brain. Well, from the lateral ventricles, the fluid is flowing to the third ventricle by the so-called the interventricular foramen, also known as the foramen of Monro. Listen to the word interventricular, means between the ventricle. So this is the foramen which is between the ventricle, and it's called the interventricular foramen, or known as the foramen of Monro. But guess what? We have 2 lateral ventricles. We have the left lateral ventricle and the right lateral ventricle. But all these ventricles, they are communicating with the third ventricle. That means we should have 2 interventricular foramina, or the foramina of Monro, because one is coming from the left lateral ventricle and the other one is coming from the right lateral ventricle. They are all emptying the fluid to the third ventricle. So interventricular foramina, or the foramina of Monro, you should never forget about it. Okay, and then from the third ventricle, this fluid will need to go to the fourth ventricle, and I've told you the third ventricle is within the diencephalon, but we have a connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. This connection is called the cerebral aqueduct, or the aqueduct of Sylvius. But because this aqueduct of Sylvius is within the midbrain, it is also referred as the cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. 3 names for it: the cerebral aqueduct, first name; the aqueduct of Sylvius, second name. The aqueduct of midbrain, that is the third name for the aqueduct of cerebus. And it's so important because it is, first of all, this is the thinnest part, the thinnest most point of this ventricular system. Like you see, the lateral ventricles are big, the interventricular foramen not so big but not thin, and the third ventricle is big. But you see, the fourth ventricle is big, but the connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, it is very thin. That is to say, this is the commonest point of obstruction. If obstruction, this is like a plumbing system, yeah, like the water flows to this direction. So if you have something which is blocking here, you will have blocking of the system, and so you have obstruction. We're going to figure out in the next discussion the so-called hydrocephalus obstruction. Obstructive hydrocephalus commonly occurs at the cerebral aqueduct or the aqueduct of the midbrain. And then I've told you this is the cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid is circulating between the brain and the spinal cord. So at some point, this fluid will need to leave the ventricular system to go to the spinal cord and, of course, subarachnoid space. Yeah, this fluid is also circulating in the subarachnoid space. So it will need to leave the ventricle to go out of the ventricles, to go out of these cavities to other places, yeah, to have a certain effect. So from the fourth ventricle, we have the lateral apertures, like they're on the lateral edges and where this fluid lives from the fourth ventricle, but also have a median aperture and median aperture. So the lateral apertures, they are called the foramina of Ruschka. It's a foramen of Ruschka if it's one, but we have two, one on the left and one on the right, and they are called the foramina of Ruschka. Okay, and then we have one midline aperture, which is called the median aperture, but it's also known as the foramen of Magendie. Let's have a different view to get what I'm emphasizing here. Okay, so if you take a 3-dimension, you understand this is the lateral ventricle. So this is right lateral ventricle and this is the left lateral ventricle. But I've told you the lateral ventricles are communicating with the third ventricle by the so-called the interventricular foramina or the foramina of Monro. So we have left foramen of Monro and the right foramen of Monro. They are emptying fluid into the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle, this fluid goes to the fourth ventricle by the so-called the aqueduct of cerebus or aqueduct of midbrain or the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and then I've told you from the fourth ventricle, we have three routes of exit. We have two lateral foramina or lateral apertures, and we've called them the apertures of Ruschka or the foramina of Ruschka, one on the left side and one on the right side. And then the median one is called the foramina or the foramen of Magendie, one foramen of Magendie. And as far as the neuroanatomy of the brain ventricular system is concerned, you can never afford to forget these foramina. They are equally important in the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. And then from the fourth ventricle, of course, from through the foramina of Ruschka, this fluid is going to enter in the subarachnoid space. You guys remember the subarachnoid space? We said this is a natural space, is where the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating. This is the cerebrospinal fluid that we were talking about the other time. Okay, but through this median aperture, through the median aperture, a certain fluid is going also to enter the ventricular, to leave the ventricular system to enter the subarachnoid space. But we also have an obex. If you guys remember the discussion on the brainstem, we said we have an obex downstairs here, and this obex is acting as a point where the cerebrospinal fluid is entering the central canal of the spinal cord. If you need me to emphasize, I will. I've said from the fourth ventricle, this fluid will now have to go to the subarachnoid space to leave the ventricular system, to go out of the ventricles, and it enters the subarachnoid space by these apertures here. So the left and right foramina of Ruschka and the foramen of Magendie. They are entering the subarachnoid space. But midline here, we also have an obex which is entering the central canal of the spinal cord. This is how the cerebrospinal fluid, a certain amount of CSF is also going to the central canal of the spinal cord, and it enters through not foramen of Magendie, but an obex. Remember, we discussed about an obex. Perhaps you have too many foramina to remember, but as I've told you, as far as the neuroanatomy of the brain ventricular system is concerned, these foramina are so much important. And maybe you get trouble to remember the foramina, but you can never forget the foramen of Monroe, interventricular foramen. The aqueduct of Sylvius, it is special, you cannot forget. The common confusion occurs here. Foramen of Lucica and Magendie. But I got a mnemonic for you, because Lucica is represented by L, then you remember that the lateral foramen is L for Lucica. It is called Lucica. Lateral foramen or lateral aperture is Lucica. Okay? L for Lucica. But the median one, median M for Magendie. Okay, so the median aperture is the foramen of Magendie. The lateral aperture L is foramen of Lucica. Let's now discuss about the part of the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle is one among the C-shaped structure because it's got the shape of letter C. And you can remember other C-shaped structures of the brain. Remember your corpus callosum, also the fornices, among other structures. Yes, lateral ventricle is also a C-shaped structure, has got the shape of letter C. Yes, these are the different parts of the lateral ventricle, and it's so important. The lateral ventricle has got constant relationship with corpus callosum and also the caudate nucleus. Remember, the caudate nucleus is also one among the C-shaped structures of the brain. Okay, and remember that the caudate nucleus is on the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. Is on the lateral side of the lateral ventricle, but the tail of the caudate nucleus is on the medial side of the lateral ventricle. Remember, the lateral ventricle is a C-shaped structure. The corpus callosum is a C-shaped structure. The caudate nucleus is also a C-shaped structure. We discussed the caudate nucleus when we were doing the basal ganglia, and we saw that the head and the body of the caudate nucleus is on the lateral side of the lateral ventricle, but the tail of the caudate nucleus is on the medial side of this horn of the lateral ventricle. So let's discuss the different parts of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so we have got the anterior horn, anterior horn, we have posterior horn, and the inferior horn. But these horns, they are present in different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, and for that reason, they can also be named depending on the lobes that they are present. For example, the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle is found within the frontal lobe, so it can also be referred as a frontal horn. So if someone says a frontal horn of the lateral ventricle, they are also meaning the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. But the posterior horn is toward the occipital lobe, and so it's also known as the occipital horn. And the inferior horn, of course, is within the temporal lobe. So the temporal horn is the other name for inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. The anterior horn is the other name for the frontal horn, and of course the posterior horn. But that's also got the body. So this is the body of the lateral ventricle, and also has got a splenium somewhere around here. So this is the anterior view of the lateral ventricle, and you can see you have the inferior horn, you have the frontal horn, and of course the posterior horn cannot be seen from this picture. Let's now talk about the cerebrospinal fluid, and we're going to discuss about the production of this fluid, circulation, and reabsorption back to the system. Okay, so the cerebrospinal fluid is being secreted within the ventricles by the so-called the choroid plexus. We have the choroid plexus, and this choroid plexus is the one which is secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. We have this choroid plexus within the ventricles, of course, within the lateral ventricles, You see you have part of it within the third ventricle, and also the part of it is coming from the fourth ventricle. This is a location. But the whole ventricular system can accommodate only 150 mils of CSF. At any given point in time, if you measure the capacity, the ability of the ventricular system is to accommodate only 150 mils of CSF. Well, give or take, some might have 145, some might have 155, but an average of 150 should be fine. At any given point in time, the capacity, the ability of the ventricular system is to accommodate only 150 mils of CSF. But guess what? The ventricles are the choroid plexus within the ventricles. They are producing the CSF at a rate of 20 mils per hour. For every 60 minutes, for every hour, 20 cc's or 20 mils of the cerebrospinal fluid is being produced. That makes it a total of 500 cc's to 500 mils in a day. But you have seen already that the capacity, the ability of the of the ventricles is to accommodate only 150 mils of CSF. But in 24 hours, you are producing 500. What does that mean? That means the produced CSF should, circulate and leave the ventricular system to give a space for a new produced 150 mils to circulate and also to leave the ventricular system. That is to say, you have to have 3 cycles of production, circulation, and reabsorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. A total of 3 cycles, because you have seen that the whole system can accommodate 150 mils, but you are producing 500. So that is to say, you have roughly 3 cycles of production, circulation, and the absorption. And this is what happens within the ventricular system. Okay, so let's see the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Once the cerebrospinal fluid CSF is formed by the ventricles, of course, from the lateral ventricles, this fluid will go to the third ventricle by the so-called the foramen of Monro. We have 2 foramen of Monro. We have the right foramen of Monro and the left foramen of Monro. But this fluid goes to the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle, the fluid will go through the aqueduct of Sylvius or the aqueduct of the midbrain to the fourth ventricle, and then from the fourth ventricle, this fluid is going to leave the ventricular system by the 3 apertures, the 2 lateral foramina or foramen of Morushika, and the 1 median foramen, which is also called the foramen of Magendie. So this is just a sagittal section showing only the right half of the brain. But I hope you guys remember that we have seen 2 foramina of Rushika, 1 on the right and 1 on the left, but we've also seen the 2 foramina of Monro, 1 on the right and 1 on the left. Once this fluid leaves the fourth ventricle, there are only 2 channels, only 2 possible ways that this fluid will go. First of all, it will go to the subarachnoid space. So this is the subarachnoid space, and also a certain fluid will also go through the just a minimum amount of fluid will go through the orbix and flows to the central canal of the spinal cord, But the majority of fluid will go to the subarachnoid space, and it will circulate to the subarachnoid space. And remember, the subarachnoid space is present both within the brain and also within the spinal cord. Yes, we have the subarachnoid space within the brain and within the spinal cord. And I want to emphasize something here, that within the subarachnoid spaces, there are some dilated pockets here. You see these pockets. These pockets here are called cisterns. They are called cisterns. We're going to discuss them later. Cisterns, yes. And cisterns are also parts of the pool of fluid, of the CSF fluid within different direct dilatation of the subarachnoid spaces to accommodate this cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF fluid. And this is the direction of circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, now after circulation, this cerebrospinal fluid has to be reabsorbed back to the system, and it is being reabsorbed by the so-called arachnoid granulations. We have the arachnoid granulations here, which are collecting this cerebrospinal fluid, and they are dumping it. They are recycling back to the julovenous sinuses, and the most important one being the superior sagittal sinus. So the superior sagittal sinus is the most common destination for the cerebrospinal fluid, but the cerebrospinal fluid is being reabsorbed by the arachnoid granulation into the durovenous sinuses. Okay, so we have seen the production of the cerebrospinal fluid within the ventricles by the so-called the choroid plexus. We have seen the circulation between different ventricles of the brain, and we've also seen that this fluid will leave the ventricular system to enter the subarachnoid space, circulating between both the cerebral, the brain and the spinal cord. But we've seen in the brain we also have some pockets of dilatation within the subarachnoid spaces. These pockets are called the cisterns, and then from the cisterns it also enters the subarachnoid spaces and it circulates throughout the brain. Now, after circulation, this fluid will have to be reabsorbed back to the system, and it's been reabsorbed by the so-called arachnoid granulations. The arachnoid, if you ask in an exam what are the functions of the arachnoid granulations, remember to say that they are absorb the cerebrospinal fluid, and they are dumping this fluid to the durovenous sinuses, and the most important one is the superior sagittal sinus. Yes, so this fluid, the destination of the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be to the durovenous sinuses, and the most important one being the superior sagittal sinus. Is this cerebrospinal fluid important? Yes, let's figure out the function of the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid has got the mechanical function, chemical function, and the circulatory function. Number one, the mechanical function of the cerebrospinal fluid is the shocking absorbing ability. So the cerebrospinal fluid is acting as the shock absorber of the brain. Whenever the brain is subjected to mechanical shock, then the cerebrospinal fluid will act to absorb that shock. I hope you know that mechanism of shocking absorbing. So the CSF is acting as the shock absorbing medium of the brain, but it's also providing buoyancy. This is why the cerebrospinal fluid is so important in terms of mechanical support or mechanical protection of the brain. Remember, we talked about the levels of protection of the brain, and we said we have all those levels of protection plus the cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid is acting as the shock absorbing medium of the brain, but it also provides buoyancy. And let me explain something very strange here, that the human brain usually weighs 1.5 kgs, but in the presence of the cerebrospinal fluid, this weight is reduced to 150 grams. Think of it, like you have 1.5 kgs, and then out of blue, this weight is reduced to 1 gram with the presence of the CSF. So it's like to say the brain is floating within the cranium by the presence of the CSF. Like it gives this buoyancy, and then the brain floats within the cranium, within this cerebrospinal fluid. But it also have a chemical protection, and this CSF is providing suitable chemical environment for neurotransmission. The transmission of nerve impulse is made possible because this CSF has got different ions that are important for propagation of action potential, among other chemical functions of chemical function within the brain. But also has got a circulatory function, because this one is the cerebrospinal fluid has also got some nutrients that transporting these nutrients to different parts of the brain. But there are also the cerebrospinal fluid is also taking off the waste products of metabolism, the carbon dioxide, and among other the waste products of metabolism that are also being removed from the system by the cerebrospinal fluid. And this is why the cerebrospinal fluid, it is so important. So this is it. In this discussion, we're going to have a separate discussion when we're talking about the clinical neuroanatomy of the ventricular system, the brain ventricular system. We're going to see what happens if something goes wrong in this circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. It was nice having this discussion with you, and see you next time. Bye bye.